Thank you very much, Nick. Now, I'm Matt Chappell. We're from, well, I am, not we. There's no one else on the stage. I am from Game Theory, and we are a marketing foresight consultancy. What that means is that we work with marketers and their businesses looking at data and analytics to understand how they can make faster, smarter, future-faced business decisions. Now, how this all plays out into the long term, what we need to do is we need to listen to our clients and to understand exactly their pain points, understand exactly what they're looking for, and understand the right kind of data and methodology to look at to help them to achieve their goals. And so we need to find the right methodology for the right thing, otherwise known as kind of everything in its right place. Now, for those of you with eagle eyes, you'll notice I've missed the E. Now, that's not my decision. That was Tom York's decision back in 2001, so I'm going to keep it that way. Now, what we know about everything in its right place is there are a number of methodologies and techniques that you can use to get a really good insight and definition of short-term, very granular success. So if you look at things like spot matching, attribution, A/B testing, they're all absolutely fantastic at going really deep into particular media types, and they're fantastic at getting you very quick answers, but they are, by their very definition, short-termist. When you look at other techniques like econometrics and stuff that Nick was talking about, that's the kind of stuff that moves you into the weeks and months rather than the hours and days. But a lot of the questions our clients were asking us was about long-term success. Now, we know that procurement and the board are not the enemy. If anything, we need to find a way of getting between marketing and the CMO and the CFO. And there is a load of research that says that currently both CMOs and CFOs feel that there's a disconnect there. We believe that one of the reasons that disconnect exists is because CFOs and also procurement are looking for numbers and fact-based kind of calculations and workings, which means you need to find a way to bring numbers to the long term, to show the CMO, to show the CFO and the CEO that it's not just about expecting jam tomorrow, but actually putting some data and putting some solid techniques behind that to help them to achieve this. So this is where our kind of long-term studies come in. Now, Matt mentioned very helpfully at the start of the event that it was about unobserved component modeling. Now, they're just 3 words. What they're basically looking at is the following, if I demonstrate. I'm going to start with Celine Dion. Now, there's been a lot of talk about icebergs, which is what made me think of Celine Dion. As you can see, my music taste pretty much stopped in 2001, so Celine Dion is still pretty relevant. And if you like this one, there's a reference to Cliff Richard later that you're absolutely going to love. Trust me. This short-termism, this focus on the easily measured, on attribution and spot matching, and as we saw from Matt's slides earlier, we believe is harming the bottom line. If you think about Jack and Rose on that iceberg, they could very easily see the top of the iceberg, and they could see that in a lot of detail as they were traveling towards it at speed. But they were only seeing 18% of that iceberg if they were viewing it through the lens of attribution modeling, which unfortunately didn't exist in 1912. Now, when they look through a short-term econometric view, they can see up to 42% of that iceberg, 42% of that real business effect. But it's only when you look at the whole iceberg, the bit above the water and the bit below the water, that you get 100% of the effect and of the impact. Which means that by focusing on the short term, we're only understanding 42% of the way marketing is driving sales and the way advertising is driving sales. And we're not understanding the pure, brilliant impact that it's playing in the long term. So we want to find a way to give some numbers towards that and to try and understand the bottom of the iceberg. So rather than going to your CFO and saying, there's some jam tomorrow, it's coming, trust me, or rather than using some of the academic figures that exist, such as advertising works 3 times as hard in the long term as it does in the short term, that's not going to fly because our business is going to be very different to the academic businesses that they studied back in the study, which I think came out in the 90s. So we want to find a way that's different, that works for all our clients, and that has nuances based on the category that they're working in. We want to find a long-term methodology. Before we start, just a couple of definitions. The long-term is, in this case, 3 years. For some clients, we look longer than 3 years, up to 5 or 6, but for the majority of our clients, this will be 3 years. Our long-term methodology is unobserved component modeling. I don't know about you, I've got somewhere I need to be tonight, so I can't spend the rest of the day explaining what unobserved component modeling is. However, ThinkBox have been lucky enough, or have been kind of foresighted enough to take some films where Nick and myself explain some of the methodologies behind this. So if you are interested in the very precise and detailed methodology, that is on thinkbox.tv. The key factor for us is that long-term multiplier. And I'll go on to the long-term multiplier in a bit. But the long-term multiplier is the definition of how much of the impact we're going to see in the long term versus the short term. So if the long-term multiplier is 2, it means that our impact in the short term is multiplied by 2 when we look at the long term. A long-term multiplier of 1, just as a definition, means that there's no additional long-term impact. So we can expect exactly the same in the long term as we just got in the short term. We've looked across categories and brands, and we've got insights drawn out mainly from retail, financial services, and FMCG here. And so this is how it works in a tiny bit of detail. Do remember that other detail exists. So the way standard econometrics works is we look at some media activity, and we might have an 8-week burst of activity. We've got almost a predetermined flat base, and this is the stuff that exists under the iceberg. In standard econometrics, a theory is that everything is mean reverting. So any activity that happens can cause a short-term spike and an uplift, but ultimately the sales go down to the base in the kind of medium to long term. So you might be able to see that this media activity has an impact. It rises up as the campaign goes on, and then it falls away as the campaign stops. But ultimately, that base is going back to being flat. And really, we thought, does it make sense for that base to be flat over time? Should that base change as tastes and preferences change? Should that base change as customers become more loyal to the brand, as we move up the consideration set? And so we developed the unobserved component methodology to understand how that base moves. So rather than having that burst of purple that then goes back to that flat line of gray, we have a burst of purple that then has a moving base over time. So we can see that very much short-term burst has a long-term continuous impact. And when we look at this, we look across different campaigns, different media types to understand how that long-term impact changes across industries, across media types, and across campaign types. So I know you're all probably itching for the results. So I've mentioned this before, and I'm not going to spend too long on it because I'm itching for the results as well. But the short-term ROI, let's say, for example, the way to read these long-term multipliers, let's say the short-term ROI is £1.50. If we have a long-term multiplier of 2, which is going to be on the next chart you see, then the long-term ROI would be 3, which is the short-term ROI multiplied by the long-term multiplier. Now, that multiplier does not have to just be applied to ROI. It can be applied to profit levels, sales levels, any of the KPIs that you're measuring in the short term. So how does it work? Now, bear in mind, I mentioned that the base of this chart is 1, which means that there's no additional impact in the long term. When we look at across all categories, what we see is the long-term multiplier is just short of 2. And this is all categories and all media types. That means a short-term ROI of £1.50 gets you that long-term ROI of £3. Now, it wouldn't be a ThinkBox study without talking about TV, and we've highlighted TV in pink. Now, across all categories, TV has the greatest average potential long-term multiplier, up at £2.50. And this compares very favorably when we look at it against radio, print, out-of-home, online display, and indeed online video, with across category TV having the strongest long-term multiplier. And there's quite an interesting link when you look across the categories here in terms of how TV performs versus how some of the other categories, some of the other media perform. If you think about TV being 100% viewable most of the time, if you think about TV being on a big screen, about telling a story over 30 seconds, it kind of makes sense that it's changing those tastes, those preferences, and that loyalty over time versus some of the other channels. And when we go through by category, what we've done here is added the grey dots in, which are the average, all category, and see how those categories change. And thinking about what Nick said earlier, FMCG is quite interesting, because even though the short-term ROIs aren't the best, when we look at it versus other categories, the long-term multipliers, on average, perform better than the all-category average. So rather than having a long-term multiplier of £1.90, we have a long-term multiplier of £2.30 across media. TV, rather than having a long-term multiplier of £2.45, has a long-term multiplier of £2.80, and vice versa. And we can see, in fact, that in FMCG, out-of-home has the biggest long-term multiplier. And that's quite interesting because, again, if you remember back to Nick's stuff, the out-of-home short-term ROI was quite low. Now, obviously, if you've got a low short-term ROI and a good long-term multiplier, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best channel in the long term, but it does slightly shift that argument away from channels that don't have a good long-term impact, potentially in this case online display. And also, we haven't included PPC, firstly to match the ubiquity work, but also because it doesn't have a long-term multiplier from the stuff that we've seen. If you move away from that to stuff that actually drives long-term success. And we look at retail. Retail, in total, performs better. TV performs better. But actually, you get a poorer performance from things like radio and print. Out-of-home doesn't perform as strongly as it does within the FMCG space. But online video really works in the average retailer case that we're looking at. And I think radio is a really interesting example, again, going back to Nick's piece of work, where we're talking about radio as an activation channel which has really strong short-term ROIs, but maybe doesn't quite drive the long-term success of something like TV or online video. And then to wrap up, we're looking at financial services. Again, an interesting picture, but here we see online video scaled back and TV scaled back slightly. Interestingly about financial services, obviously, the loyalty takes longer to play out, whereas in an FMCG, you can become loyal within a period of months. Within financial services, it takes years to become loyal to something, and potentially that affects the results. And I am so glad that Nick did such a good job of explaining interquartile ranges, because there's one coming up for you now. But what we've got here is the interquartile range for the long-term multipliers, where when we see in totality, the range goes from £1.50 to £2.20. What we see again is TV not only has the highest low point, it also has a very high high point. So TV, in terms of long-term success, is one of the safest risks in terms of media investment. And when we look at it across everything, you can actually see that TV is the safest risk. Something like VOD has a massive range due to the variability that we can see in performance in that channel. Something like print or radio has a smaller range, but the lower point is lower. So I promised Cliff Richard, and I appreciate for some people this might be controversial, but the reason Cliff Richard is here is that he is the only person, singer, act, musical band to have a #1 in every decade since the charts began. He is tremendously consistent. It might not be a great consistency, but he's very consistent, and he perseveres. And the reason for showing this is, we wanted to delve behind why TV works and what makes TV work in the long term. And when we looked at our study, we stacked up the results versus a load of different factors and different kind of shared and not shared capabilities. And what we found was that two biggest driving points for long-term success were consistency and perseverance. That's consistency of message and persevering with the campaign over time. If you think of that Galaxy campaign that went on for 3 or 4 years recently, and this completely kind of blows open that argument of campaigns that are planned, executed, and finished within a 6-month time frame. They're not, according to our study, the kind of campaigns that are actually going to deliver long-term success. So it's definitely worth bearing that one in mind. We also looked at how the long term plays out. So I completely appreciate that we've thrown a load of numbers at you. We've thrown away long-term multipliers. And obviously, we work with our clients to define these long-term multipliers. Appreciate not everyone in here is one of our clients, and that's fine. But what we want to give you is a way of understanding how that jam tomorrow can be played out in terms of jam today. What are some of the leading indicators for long-term brand success? And again, when we looked at all the data and all the analysis, the two that came to us first were an increased brand health and reduced price sensitivity. So an increase in brand health today can have a positive impact on your base sales tomorrow. Likewise, a reduced sensitivity to price from your consumers today can have a long-term positive brand impact in the future. And so these are tangible things that the CFO can look at today that indicates that there's long-term future success. And when we looked at brand health, for around 65% of the clients we work with, consideration was the strongest measure of brand health. And we found that a 1 percentage point rise in consideration is equivalent to a 0.5 to 1.5 percentage point uplift in base sales. So, which is great if you're a growing brand with growing consideration, but you can also flip this around to say that actually a 1% fall in consideration is equivalent to a 0.5 or 1.5% fall in base sales. And often for a lot of the brands that we work with who've been established for a long time, it's not necessarily about making that base grow. It's just as important to keep that consideration and that base stable and consistent where it is. And likewise, with price sensitivity, one of the things we found was actually a share of voice increase of 10%, which I appreciate is a large number, can cause a 5 to 20% decrease in price sensitivity over time. And really showing that E, share of voice, is a strong metric for things like price sensitivity. And so here's our headlines. Short-termism is undoubtedly harming the bottom line because we're not seeing the full impact of our marketing and media investments. We need to, as an industry, take a long-term view. Because the long-term effect of media is significant, but not only is it significant, it's different across categories, media channels, and brands within those categories. As a rule, and as an average, TV drives the highest long-term multiplier. Out-of-home and online video can be successful in certain categories, but certain channels do not drive the same long-term multiplier that TV drives. Perseverance and consistency are key to upping this long-term multiplier. So whenever you're looking at dropping a media plan after 5 months, just think of Cliff Richard. And brand health and price elasticity are the greatest short-term lead indicators for long-term impact. But I'm going to say this, that you can't beat a modeled view. So with those headlines, I'm going to hand back to Nick, who's going to look at how it all comes together to show how the short term and the long term can work to drive success.